Welcome to this brief introduction to rubrics for grading. The assumption with this video is that you're not very familiar with rubrics. Maybe you've heard the term, but you haven't used them in your own grading or assessment practices. So we'll go through the basic concepts of rubrics, some of the common terminology used when discussing rubrics, and how a rubric is put together on paper. There are plenty of definitions for rubrics. I found this one by Heidi Goodrich, which I think is one of the more straightforward. According to Goodrich, a rubric is a scoring tool that lists the criteria for a piece of work or what counts. It also articulates gradations of quality for each criterion. The terms you'll want to remember when dealing with rubrics are levels, what Goodrich calls gradations of quality, and criteria. As you're talking about rubrics, you'll hear a couple of different terms and ways to describe rubrics: holistic and analytic. A holistic rubric is a fairly simple one. It describes levels of performance, but not individual criteria. A holistic rubric for a student reflection might just say that an excellent reflection is one that demonstrates serious thought, explores multiple ideas, and is clearly written, while a good reflection is one that demonstrates an attempt at serious thought, explores one or more ideas, and is generally well written. Obviously, you would go on to describe, say, just an adequate reflection, and also an unacceptable one. But for the grader, there would be only those four options. In this case, excellent, good, adequate, and unacceptable. This kind of rubric makes grading pretty simple, but since each submission you only have this one set of choices, but it limits the feedback the student receives since it's only generic. An analytic rubric describes specific criteria and levels of performance for each. Instead of saying, here's what an excellent reflection looks like, it will break down the idea into different criteria, say, again, depth of thought, extent of ideas, and quality of writing. Then it would provide a description of each level. Again, to go back to our example, excellent, good, adequate, and unacceptable, and describe those levels for each of the criteria. As you can guess, this kind of rubric requires more thought and time to use, but it gives much more unique and individualized feedback to the student. So let's take a look at how a rubric is put together. Here we're going to focus on analytic rubrics. These are the student learning outcomes for our X-Core written communication outcome. Starting with the outcomes you are trying to achieve with your assignment is critical to good rubric development. It also builds in that idea of alignment that's so important to effective teaching. As we were developing the rubric for written communication, we started with these SLOs and made each one a criterion for our rubric. Then we asked, what is our goal here? What is our highest expectation for each of these criteria? So we developed this outline, and as you can see, it gets into some pretty specific details. Now we have a specific explanation of what our expectation for each aspect of good written communication is. But we can't expect everyone to meet that highest level. So we step back and say, what can, in this case, someone who's in the process of learning good written communication demonstrate for each of these criteria? As you can see, the language changes here, but only somewhat. Now you should be able to start to see how useful this kind of rubric can be, as the grader can pick and choose how the student is doing within each criterion. We still need to add at least one more level here. In this case, we called it developing. And as you can see, again, how the language changes while maintaining some consistency. As we use this rubric for grading or assessing student writing, we might end up with something like this. The student demonstrates proficiency with context and purpose and sources and evidence while having a bit of trouble with content development and genre convention, but the student is really struggling with syntax and mechanics. Now I hope you can see how useful this is both for the teacher and the student. Given a full class's rubric results, we might see a pattern that suggests, as we work on the next paper, that we need to give more attention to the area of syntax and mechanics. Meanwhile, each student can see what areas they need to focus on to improve their writing. To wrap up, I've modified the definition we began with. Now I want to say that a rubric is a scoring tool that lists the criteria for a piece of work, that also articulates the gradations of quality for each criterion. It is also a feedback tool that helps students focus on future improvement. If you think about both those things, you'll develop some really useful rubrics, which will save you time with your grading and will help your students as they work to improve in your class. Speaking from experience, I can tell you that providing this kind of feedback to students really cuts down on the unnecessary questions you get from students. Now, they don't have to come to you and say, why did I get a C on this paper? Because the rubric tells them why they got a C. Instead, they can come to you and say, can you help me understand why I'm having trouble with my sources and evidence? Okay, that's our brief primer on rubrics. Thanks for watching.